It followed me from Deadwood, and the door closed. The first time Jonah noticed something wrong with the door, it was before the truck had even left Deadwood. He'd bought the piece from a woman who kept antiques in an old general store with lace curtains and a radio that hummed like a memory. The door was too large for his windows and too precise for his habits. Warped oak, the black iron studs flattened by hands he could not imagine. It felt heavier than wood. When he hauled it into the back of his hatch and glanced at the small town slipping away, a man at the diner watched him with a look that seemed like a warning instead of curiosity. Back in his narrow house, the night he propped the door against the living room wall, Jonah woke twice to the sound of something soft sliding across hardwood. He told himself it was the wind, the house settling, the city noise from the street below. In the mirror above the mantel, his reflection stared back with a small crease of worry he didn't feel in waking life. The mirror missed the lower half of his face, as if it had decided to keep its own counsels. He sat with a mug gone cold and business cards for Hale restorations that seemed suddenly brittle, like paper absorbed with old rain. There was a photograph tucked behind the trim, the sort that slips out of frames when they're pried by time. It was black and white, a town fair, a Ferris wheel, bundles of people with umbrellas. Jonah almost thought his hands trembled until he realized the faces in the picture were smudged, as if someone had run a thumb through ink. One face in the crowd felt wrong in the way old scars feel familiar. It lingered at the edge of recognition until he remembered he had never met anyone who looked like that. He set the photograph on the table to dry, though nothing on it seemed wet. Maggie Carruthers appeared the next afternoon with an apple pie, hands steady, voice thin as thread. "Don't leave it on the floor," she said about the door, and the warning arrived unadorned, like a piece of furniture with a specific weight. She told him about doors people left behind in Deadwood, how they stayed when their owners didn't, how they'd appear in odd places like kept secrets. Jonah, who had restored cabinet doors and written invoices, listened because Maggie's eyes had the patience of someone who had seen a pattern and wanted nothing to do with its consequences. The brass key found its way to Jonah's palm like a small accusation. It had been in the pocket of an old coat he'd hung in the back room, cold and stamped with a letter that looked like an eye. It fit nowhere in Jonah's apartment, not the mailbox, not the front door, not the cabinet where he kept spare plates. Yet, when he set it on the sill by the Deadwood door, the metal hummed faintly, as if acknowledging a neighborhood it remembered. He began testing locks he had owned for years, more out of ritual than hope, each time hearing the echo of a hinge somewhere unreachable. That first night, the house remembered footsteps that hadn't been there earlier. Jonah lay awake and counted them, impossible to distinguish from the pipes or the noise outside. 3 stairs down, 2 soft pauses, the sound of a hand laid against oak. The Deadwood door sat propped where he'd left it, closing off the couch like a foreign closet. Each sound lodged at the base of his throat. He didn't want to look, but the rhythm of small shocks pulled him to the doorway. On the other side, the hall was empty and smelled faintly of dusty fairs and wet wood. He tried take the door back to Deadwood. The highway that cut through the valley felt thinner than it had been. Towns under flat skies look like stage sets. Jonah pulled into a motel on the outskirts when a rainstorm made the trailer's windows stare like black eyes. The room's mirror was a narrow strip hung crooked above the dresser. Its surface split the light oddly and refused to show Jonah's hands as he untied a shoelace. Reflections become unreliable in two ways: what they leave out and what they substitute. He slept with the key under his pillow anyway. Back home, the photograph had changed. Jonah swore at first that it was the light. Then that denial felt small and dishonest. A face that had been blurred was sharper, and someone else in the crowd had slipped away, an absence like a missing tooth. He began keeping a notebook of differences, small inventory marks to anchor the world. Pages filled with observations. The left doorknob warms at dusk. The kettle whistles a second late. A neighbor's porch light flips on twice and not 3 times. Each notation made him feel both more precise and more helpless. Maggie told him in a voice that wore years like a coat that Deadwood's doors collected things: names, laughter, arguments, not everything, but enough memories that a threshold could carry a rumor of someone who belonged. "You open them wrong," she said, "and they look for the rest." He listened and thought of how he'd handled Oak for a living, smoothing age into dignity, never asking what the grain might remember. A door is meant to be passed through. If you took one across town, perhaps you carried more than wood. Perhaps it now carried expectation. After that, the world tightened. Photos continued to misbehave, details rearranged like furniture in a room that shifts when you're looking away. Mirrors offered partial truth, mirrored slivers that omitted a shoulder, a collarbone, or the lower half of someone's face. Once, Jonah glanced into a window on Sycamore and saw, caught between panes, the Deadwood door standing where no door should be. In the hallway of the neighbor's bright interior, closing and opening without hands. He became precise in his avoidance. He checked reflections only in brief, measured glances. On the night the hinge found its small voice and began to whisper, Jonah stood exactly where he had promised himself he wouldn't, on the threshold. The brass key fit the Deadwood door's keyhole with a reluctance like a locked throat. It did not click open the way keys usually do its side, and the sound felt like a room remembering an entire season. He thought he saw someone on the other side, a movement that could have been a sleeve or a shadow. For a long minute, the world held its breath, and he felt absurdly grateful for the small, human tremor of fear. He did not open the door, not fully. What followed was quieter, a sense of completion. The door moved an inch, then another, closing as if settling into a shape it had been missing. The house seemed to agree, the air pressing around him like a hand that fit the hand-shaped hollow in a glove. When Jonah turned back toward the living room, light from the window showed the photograph on the table had shifted again, another face blurred, and in its place, a small empty space like a held breath. He understood, with a clarity that tasted like winter, that some departures substitute instead of vacating. Jonah left the key on the sill, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and slept sitting in the armchair until dawn suggested it was polite to resume the world. When he woke, the door was shut, close in the way a verdict is close. He walked the house with the careful reverence of a man checking relics. The mirror above the mantel now showed only a sliver of his cheek. The photograph had an empty place at its edge. And outside, from the other side of the street, the neighbor's porch light blinked once and stayed lit. In the loosened air, he felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. He left town the next week with a small bag and the memory of Maggie's final warning. You'll learn the difference between carrying something and bringing something with you. When the highway opened up and the trees thinned, Jonah glanced in the rear view and expected the dark gape of the doorless house. Instead, the house stood with its ordinary emptiness. But much later, at the lull of a red light in a place he'd never been, a pedestrian glanced across the street and momentarily froze, fingers at the side of his face as if checking a lock. Jonah felt, under his ribs, the echo of a closing. Months later, the mail brought a postcard with no stamp and no return address. A tiny photograph of a fairground, edges browned, a strip of sky that matched Deadwood's summer blue. On the back, someone had written a single sentence in a hand Jonah didn't know. It keeps people safe by making room. He could have been relieved. He could have been furious. Instead, he folded the postcard and placed it inside the old box that held the book of invoices he kept for work. Sometimes, late at night, he hears a hinge sigh in a town he now drives through without thinking. Sometimes, it is only a car closing its glove box. Sometimes the noise follows,